Pravit Moy Druzy. Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gertis. I'm just a professor who's trying to help you understand context in the war in Ukraine. Today, I want to talk about Jake Bro. Jake Bro is one of the YouTubers who does a consistent and thorough job in trying to understand, the news regularly. He does a very good job, and I want to see if we can test or verify things that he was saying in his last video. So this is the video I'm going to talk about. Now, I'm only going to show you a brief clip of what he had to say, and then we'll see if we can verify what he was talking about. So here we go.
Welcome back, Defenders. Jake here. This is an interesting story. He's a war criminal. An elite Putin security officer has defected to the West. But actually this occurred 6 months ago, but we're only learning about it now. A Russian engineer named Gleb Karkulov boarded a flight from Kazakhstan to Turkey with his wife and daughter. He switched off his phone and said goodbye to his life in Russia as he tried to calm his fast-beating heart.
So Bro's going to go on and talk about how this individual has some real unique insight into Putin himself. And then he's going to show us a little bit about how Putin welcomes the new U.S. ambassador. And then we'll talk about what I'm going to talk about.
President has become a war criminal. It is time to end this war and stop being silent. So what exactly did this guy do? As an engineer in a field unit of the Presidential Communications Department of the Federal Protective Service, this is the FSO, Karkulov was responsible for setting up secure communications for the Russian president and the prime minister wherever they went. While he was not a confidant of Putin's, Karkulov spent years in his service observing him from unusually close quarters from 2009 to when he left in 2022. Karkulov, his wife, and his child have gone underground. So this story of his escape is kind of wild. I'll link this clip to CNN in a pinned comment down below if you want to check it out.
And I'll link to Jake Bro so that you can see not only the whole video here, but you can also see that link if you want to see it.
But this guy was listening to Putin's phone calls for 13 years before defecting to the West. So I'm sure he had some interesting stories to tell. Partly for this reason, Russia is now confiscating passports of all their senior officials to stop defections.
Now, isn't that interesting that that's the approach, to just take away all the passports of senior officers that might defect? Like, this is something that you only do if you're really paranoid. And that's what I want to talk about, is the paranoia. And you'll see Jake talk about more of the paranoia in just a moment. Watch this clip.
Kremlin tightens Soviet-era travel restrictions in sensitive areas. These are rats fleeing a sinking ship. Trust me, you don't want to be stuck in Russia without a passport when the civil war breaks out. In other diplomatic news, the United States has sent a new ambassador to Russia, and Putin used this as an opportunity to publicly scold her and blame the United States for everything. So what this clip is a credential presentation ceremony for various new ambassadors to Russia, but Putin wanted to single this woman out. This is Lynn Tracy in the Blue Jackets, and I'll read for you what Putin says. Relations between Russia and the United States, which directly determine global security and stability, are unfortunately in a deep crisis. It is based on fundamentally different approaches to the formation of the modern world order. Dear Miss Ambassador, I don't want to break the nice atmosphere of presenting credentials, and I know you may not agree with my view, but I cannot help saying today that the use by the United States of such tools in its foreign policy as supporting the so-called color revolutions...
Now, that color revolutions thing is going to be important, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Let him keep talking.
Supporting the coup in 2014 has ultimately led to the current Ukrainian crisis and further contributed negatively to the deterioration of Russian-American relations. So Putin's official position is that Ukraine does not have the right to self-determination. It's a fake country. Russia and the Kremlin gets to rule the government in Kyiv in perpetuity forever. If the people of Ukraine have a revolution and want to have true democracy, well, that's not allowed. That violates
And that is a pretty fair assessment of the Russian perspective of what Ukraine can or can't do. Let's keep going.
Russia's rule of we get to control Ukraine forever. This woman doesn't care. She knows that Putin is a mass murderer, and more than likely a year from now, he will no longer be the president of Russia. And let me read for you this next part. I always think this is interesting. When the credential presentation ceremony ended, he says, unfortunately, this is the end of the ceremony. Because of the sanitary restriction still being in effect, we will not be able to speak with you in person, but in the course of your work, I'm sure you will have the opportunity to do so on several occasions.
Now, this is interesting. Don't miss this. Like, he is changing the ceremony to stay at a distance from these people because of COVID restrictions, and he's just got this paranoid vibe going on. And he's going to talk about it a little bit more, and then I'll talk about what I was going to talk about to see if we can verify what, Jake's perspective.
So Putin does not let anyone in his own government get within 30 meters of him. So, of course, he's not going to shake the hands and get close to and talk to these new ambassadors to Russia. So whenever Putin walks into this room, he always comes from his security bunker in the back. As soon as he's done talking at the podium, he immediately retreats back into his bunker.
Now, that in and of itself is not necessarily a sign that, the paranoid. The president, when he comes out to give a speech, usually comes down the same corridor in the United States. That's not necessarily. But you see, if there's a building case for something, you kind of see more and more layers. For example, he has the same replica kinds of office in multiple locations so that other people don't know where he's speaking from. Is he speaking from Moscow, or is he in Sochi, or is he in this place or that place? And so people can't necessarily find him. That's kind of a paranoid kind of mentality. I'm not sure that's like, you would think this was weird if the president of the United States was doing that same kind of thing.
He won't even shake the hands of these new ambassadors to Russia. So my question to you is that if sanitary restrictions are preventing him from getting close to ambassadors to Russia, who the heck is this guy? This is the Kremlin's official website, and this event was in January, talking about meeting with university students to mark Russian Students' Day. Who the heck is this guy wearing platform shoes, trying to look taller than these women, meeting with all these students if there are currently sanitary restrictions in place?
Now, I don't know that there's a body double, but let's say that there is. That would make his case. I'm not saying that there is because I don't have definitive proof, but Jake may be onto something here. Now, what I really want to do is show you this. This is an article written by two professors, one from Wayne State University and another from Emory University. It's talking about the psychology of dictators, power, fear, and anxiety. And I'm going to show you a little bit of a PowerPoint later from my Power and Influence class about Lord Acton and power corrupts and that kind of thing. But what we're going to do is look at what paranoid leaders are like. Now, there's a wealth of scholarly evidence that shows that the longer that somebody stays in power, particularly an authoritarian leader, the more paranoid they become over time, more than likely. And I think that's kind of what's happening to President Putin. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't claim that I have diagnosed him, but just as you listen to this discussion of what paranoia looks like, does it sound like Putin? So the article begins like this. They see themselves as very special people, deserving of admiration, and consequentially have difficulty empathizing with the feelings and needs of others. There's a pervasive pattern of grandiosity and vindictiveness. And he goes on to, or they go on to talk about Adolf Hitler and Mao and Joseph Stalin and Pol Pot and other totalitarian dictators. Dictatorial leaders such as these represent the extreme potential of the human capacity for evil. And yet, despite their apparent omnipotence, like they actually do seem to be almost godlike, right? These individuals also tend to suffer from excessive anxiety. Now, you wouldn't think that you would put these together, but I think this is true. And I think Putin is struggling with anxiety, a paranoid anxiety coming from threats that he sees all around them. And again, with that time in office leading to greater paranoia, that threat of anxiety of what's going to happen to me ramps up. Now, one of the best explanations, I talked about the color revolution earlier, I stopped you there. One of the best explanations that I've seen for why Putin invaded Ukraine was not NATO expansion, but the threat of Ukraine being a democratic state right on the doorstep with the previous revolution of dignity, the Maidan Revolution in 2014, and looking around the world and seeing various color revolutions and seeing like what happened to Gaddafi and thinking, wow, something like this could happen to me. So checking it on his doorstep was very important to him. That's not the only explanation. There's multiple causes. There's no univariate explanation, single explanation for what has caused the war in Ukraine. But I think that is one of a number of building blocks of what led Putin to actually invade Ukraine. Now, the author said these individuals also tended to suffer from excessive anxiety, mostly regarding paranoid fear of citizen uprising or assassination. And he gives some examples. Saddam Hussein displayed a level of paranoia so great that he had multiple meals prepared for him across the Iraqi land each day to ensure that no one knew where he was eating. Like, okay, I don't want to be poisoned, so I have all these different meals, and the odds that one of them is going to get me is reduced. Kim Jong-il, this isn't Kim, the current president, but his father, exhibited such an excessive fear of assassination while flying that he exclusively traveled via armored plated train. Putin does that now. He travels by an armor-plated train. The Burmese dictator was so concerned about the tenuous nature of his rule that he once moved the capital of Burma to a remote location in the jungle. Okay, so Putin goes to multiple locations and you can't even tell exactly where he is at any given time. It's like he's got to keep on the move or somebody might get him. Okay, power and fear. Men who sought to rule with an iron fist were also driven by hidden, extreme, and sometimes irrational fear of what fate might befall them. Saddam Hussein thought of himself as savior of the Iraqi people. And that sounds really interesting because Putin likens himself to Peter the Great, and he has this kind of grandiose rhetoric. Muammar Gaddafi once had himself crowned as King of Kings of Africa, and the North Korean Kim line of succession proclaimed themselves to be godlike. Why would individuals who are so confident in their power have such severe anxiety? Now, what if Putin is actually suffering from a severe anxiety, like crippled by this anxiety, paranoid about it? He's going to act in ways that are different than what you and I would act as, and it will even be acting in predictable ways based on that fear, based on that anxiety. Many of these individuals were actually under constant threat of assassination, and it may have happened even to Putin as well. Now, narcissism is also a consistent trait. Narcissistic individuals have a greatly exaggerated sense of their own importance and are preoccupied with their own achievements and abilities. And this sounds just like them. They see themselves as very special people, deserving of admiration, and consequently have difficulty empathizing with the feelings and needs of others. If you can send hundreds of thousands of your countrymen into slaughter others who you call the same as you, that's the Ukrainians, in order to have a genocide of these people because they're just not that into you anymore, you might have a problem with empathizing. Now, there's a really interesting study about empathy, and I talk about it in my Power and Influence class. What they do is they ask you, they prime them for power. Now, priming for power means they think about some scenario where they were in charge or they had some power, and it actually does emulate what a person in a position of power might do, which is different than what an average person might do without power. And then they ask them to write an E on their forehead, a capital E, one way or the other, right? Okay, so when they write the E on their forehead, if they've been primed for power, they write it one way, and if they've been primed away from power, or if they've not been primed for power, they write it the other way. So if you have not been primed for power, you write the E in such a way that it is actually readable by the audience. And if you've been primed for power, you write the E in the way that it looks right to you. It's a really weird thing, but what it's showing is the difference in empathy or perspective or self. And so the person that has been, so powerful people tend to be more focused on themselves and less empathetic to others. And that's what the nature of the research found. And it doesn't take a lot of power to really just kind of just become a jerk and rule over other people. I've seen my 9-year-old talk down to my 6-year-old saying, well, when I was your age, I've seen a class full of like elementary school students trying to out-shush each other because they were like, shh, no, you, shh, no, shh, shh, right? Because what they were doing was, how can I one-up each other? Like, it doesn't take a lot of power to go to people's heads. Now, Putin is an interesting case because Putin has actually been in power. Like, go and look at what positions he's been in for over 20 years, either as president or as the prime minister of Russia or as president before that. I mean, president, prime minister, president, over 20 years. That's way too long. And again, everything that we know about the amount of time that people stay in power, the longer they stay in power, especially absolute kind of power, as Putin has had essentially absolute power. He's been democratically voted, but you wonder about the elections, but he's essentially an absolute kind of dictator with some limited constraints of yes men that will approve whatever he says. But the longer you stay in power in those kind of conditions, the more paranoid you tend to become. Okay, let's get back to this. So narcissistic individuals have greatly exaggerated sense of their own importance, pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. Now, these individuals are preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success. If you had a fantasy of unlimited success, might you have done what you did in Ukraine? Again, I'm not a psychologist, but let's just see what lines up. They also believe that they're unique. They require excessive admiration to remain happy, an extreme sense of entitlement. They exploit others, and they're often envious of others. They also found that vindictiveness is common in these leaders. Like, if you give them negative information, wow, they really give it to you. They kill the messenger. Researchers found that highly narcissistic individuals were more likely to try to punish those individuals who negatively evaluated their work. More recent work shows that after a negative evaluation, narcissistic people will demonstrate greater aggression, even to individuals unrelated to the feedback. So they tend to be that kind that's going to kill the messenger. Researchers have identified 2 forms of narcissism: grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism. Now, that's really interesting. Vulnerable narcissism is associated with an insecure grandiosity, which seems to produce an intense defensiveness and feelings of inadequacy. And that might be what you're dealing with, where somebody is paranoid, they're worried who's gonna take what from me, and I've got to fight for everything that I have. And so there's something really true about this, and I'm not exactly sure that this is what's going on with Putin, but let's just hear what it has to say. Last little bit. The intensity of the emotional experiences produced by narcissism in combination with actual dangers could produce remarkable levels of anxiety, worry, uncertainty, to the point that one might actually consider moving their entire capital to the middle of a jungle, or, in Putin's case, to have multiple versions of his office around the country where nobody knows where he is, or to be sheltered in a bunker, or to have people not be able to meet with him for 2 weeks. This time so far later from COVID, that because he's paranoid about COVID or whatever he's paranoid about. Body doubles might be a thing. I don't know. I can't prove it yet, so I'm not going to say it, but this is the kind of thing that a paranoid might do. Now, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, said Lord Acton. Now, I want to show you a slide from my Power and Influence class. This is Lord Acton and the famous dictum that power corrupts, tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I want to show you a couple of other lines in there. He's writing to Bishop Creighton, who's writing a history about some great individuals in time. And he says, I cannot accept your canon that we are to judge Pope and King unlike other men. Like, they should be treated the same way, right? Okay, great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Did you catch that? The higher that person is, the more likely they are to be corrupt, is what he's saying. Even when they're only exercising influence, not even authority, they just tend to corrupt over time. He says there's no worse heresy than that the office sanctifies the holder of it. Now that could apply to both king and pope. He says, here are the greatest names coupled with the greatest crimes. So here's what Acton's saying. If you randomly assembled 100 people just randomly from society and you looked at how many crimes they've committed, and then you took 100 world leaders, you'd probably find a lot more blood on the hands of those world leaders, because the higher they go, the more prone they are to corruption. And the more authoritarian those leaders are, the more prone that they are to not only corruption, but paranoia. I think that Jake Bro is onto something here with his analysis about Putin. Now, I can't verify that this is a body double, but I think that the general pattern of Putin's paranoia is pretty clear. What do you think? If you have a question or if you want to contradict me in some way, tell me what you think. I'm happy to hear it. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.